It feels like we've waited 366 times 2 for this year. Plenty of time to rethink your grand entrance. In you enter. They think you're going in for a bear hug, you run for it, secretly slipping a holiday scratcher in both back pockets, boom. That entrance would be money, like top prizes ranging from $500 to $500,000. Play along with holiday scratchers from the Virginia Lottery at a retailer near you. For odds and more information, visit VALottery.com.
It takes a lot of ingredients to fix or build a car, like cooking, but without the frozen dinner easy way out. eBay Motors has 122 million parts. It's always the right fitment, so you can follow any recipe to a T. Whether it's a vintage Italian coupe that's classic like Grandma's meatballs, or a German luxury car that's as complicated as Oma's rouladen, to cook up something great in the garage, use the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Elmo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast. I am Elmo and I'm with my awesome friend here, Joel Furches, is on my show on this a second time now. We are going to dive into a specific topic, which is deconversion. And Joel has done a lot of studies on this academically, and I'm going to ask him about what he has learned about this and how we could apply the information that he has brought to the table. So Joel, can you introduce yourself?
Certainly. I'm Joel Furches, and I currently work with students that are at-risk children. So they're children from bad backgrounds that have emotional and behavioral difficulties. I am academically pursuing my PhD in psychology, and my dissertation that I'm working on toward my PhD is in the subject of religious deconversion, meaning how does somebody go from identifying as religious to identifying as irreligious? And when I say irreligious, I mean something like an atheist or an agnostic, somebody who stands specifically against the idea of religion, versus what they would call a none, meaning that they just don't have any kind of religious affiliation or opinion. So that's deconversion. That's largely what I do. Now, I have worked in apologetics. I still am affiliated with a group called the Mentionables, but I try not to cross my apologetics with my academic research, because in order for the research to be taken seriously, I don't want to transport my personal opinions and biases into the research.
Can you sort of tell us the reason as to why you've chosen this specific topic?
Okay, I love that question because the backstory for this is great. In 2016, I was working as a Christian journalist. I wasn't writing for a Christian publication. I was just doing a Christian column for a general news publication on the web. And I had to kind of come up with my own stories because it's a column, but they had to be something in the related to news. So I decided to run a series on atheists that had become Christians. So here I am writing stories and publishing them on the publication about these sort of atheists that have gone through a conversion experience and become Christians. And it was the most popular thing I'd ever done. I had multiple requests to have this material republished in other forums, and I had people contacted me about it, and it drew attention from both Christians and atheists. Atheists weren't so positive about it, but Christians loved it. They ate that stuff up. But the thing is that I have a background in psychology, and I was very interested as I was doing the series to see that there are these patterns that were developing of sort of similarities. There, these stories all kind of fell into a similar process as these atheists became Christians. So that interested me as a psychologist, even though I was approaching the stories as a journalist. And at the same time, I have these atheists who are contacting me about my articles saying, are you going to be fair and write a series of articles from the other side about Christians that become atheists? And, as I'm seeing these patterns develop, that really intrigued me. And I was thinking, yeah, I would like to see that. I would like to look at these stories of deconversion and see if there are similar patterns that I can find. So it took me a number of years to get around to it. But again, when I did it, I was intending to do it exactly as I had done the others. Just write a series of articles, sort of biographical accounts of these these Christians that had become atheists. And then after I'd written that series, use a sort of a case study to write a meta study about the common features of these stories. What I didn't expect to happen was, as I began that process, to see the patterns that were developing from these deconversion stories were way more concrete and easy to spot than the patterns I saw out of the conversion stories, to the point where I could almost predict where the story was going as I was reading or listening to it. And so I developed a much more fully fleshed out model of the deconversion process than I had of the conversion. And it led me down a rabbit hole. I began to read academic studies that had been done in the field of deconversion, which has really accelerated in recent years. You really don't see any academic studies about deconversion until about 2009, and then they sort of double every year after that because it's becoming a more visible trend. Every year we have 2 or 3 Christian celebrities that come out and announce to the world that they've become atheists. And so it's becoming something that's very visible in the world. And as a result, it's drawn a lot of academic interest. So I'm reading these studies, I'm doing my own study, and it's become more or less the thrust of my life currently. I have a YouTube channel that I call Switching Sides, where I cut videos about my research and about other things in the field of conversion and deconversion experiences.
I see. And so in terms of the researches that you read, for example, one back the recent one in 2009, it's not very up to date, of course. It's been about 10 years or so or more. So what was the conclusions of that study about deconversion?
So there's a number of studies about deconversion, and they've focused on various things. The 2009 one, I think, and I don't have the bibliography in front of me right now to tell you the actual statistics, but I think that the 2009 study was one on why deconversions tended to come out of fundamentalist churches. And so that was pretty interesting, and it lent to my study a great deal because it helped me understand a trend that I was seeing otherwise. And then we've seen studies, several studies that model the deconversion process similar to what I've done. One study was a grounded theoretical study, which had talked about the deconversion related to internet. Does internet lend to deconversion? And in a way it does, and I can get into the specifics of that if you like. Other models have been looking at common personality features of deconverts. There have been models that have been looking at sort of a process of, the things that deconverts talk about as objections that have led to their deconversion. So as you can see, these studies focus on different aspects of the same process.
All right. So well, I want to understand though, how did you approach this? I guess, of course, from an academic standpoint and with no emotional baggages or biases, you throw that out before you actually do a proper study, right? So what was the method that you use in order to develop the model that you developed that you have right now?
So initially my method was going to be the same thing I used with the conversion studies that I did, which was to simply find individuals who had deconverted and had kind of come out and talked about it. And I was approaching it not as a researcher, but as a journalist initially. And so what I was trying to do was find cases where this person had written or talked about it in several different forums, like they'd done interviews and maybe they'd written a book or a blog post or something, which allowed me to multi-source it. And by that, I mean, it allowed me to see more than one source of this story and kind of compare them and pull out the features that were common among them. And then I was going to write up a series of articles on each of these cases and then use those as my background. As I began to do that, however, I stopped writing them as articles and started pulling out common features as I became more and more familiar with this process. And I started looking for things like, what was the age that they converted in the first place? What was the age of deconversion? What are the common church backgrounds? What demographic of the population were they coming out of, and so on and so forth. And so I stopped doing it like a journalist and started working like a researcher as I continued into the process. So ultimately what happened is I did a case study of about 32 deconversion cases. And from that case study, I went back and I looked for specific features that they all shared. And then I pulled out those features and I began to crunch them statistically to try to come up with statistics that I can link those features to.
The statistics, can you talk more about that? Like, what did you start on, and then how did you identify the variables in order that they were common, the patterns that you saw, and in order to have the 5-stage model?
So initially, all it was is simply reading or listening to these deconversion accounts. And as I read and listened to them, I began to notice certain features that were similar among them. And as I began to notice them, of course, at that point, it's called anecdotal, meaning I was just listening to stories. I wasn't analyzing the stories. But as I became more and more familiar with those stories, I started to know the kinds of things I wanted to look for. And so if I thought, for instance, that it seems like a lot of these people had parents or grandparents in the ministry, that's just a conclusion I arrive at anecdotally by listening to these stories. So then what I do is I go back through the stories and I look at the individual cases and I look for relatives in the ministry. And I see, how many of these cases include that feature. And if it's, say, 60% of the cases that conclude that feature, then that's a significant element to these stories. And it's worth looking into further. And so, first of all, it's familiarizing myself with the material. And after that, it's actually looking into it and seeing how many of my observations match with the real data.
All right. So, can you start about talking about the 5-stage model? Can you first? My first question would be, how how did it start? And did it start first from initially from maybe 2 and then 3, or maybe initially it was like 10 and then you sort of summarized them into 5? How did you go about this?
Again, it was similar to what I was just saying. As I became familiar with them, I noticed what I felt, this model started to develop in my mind as I'm listening to these stories, and the stories all kind of go the same way. And so in my mind, I'm saying, well, here, this looks like stage 1, this looks like stage 2, etc. Once I had that model in my mind, I had to go back to the stories and see if that model actually worked predictively for the stories. So I say, okay, if this is stage 1, do all the stories share this feature? And when they all do, I've got something solid to go with for stage 1. After I developed the 5-stage model, I have been invited on a couple of shows similar to yours, except Atheist, and shared my model with them. And they were able to relate to it. They said, yeah, this sounds a lot like my experience, my journey. And after I published the article and I've, spoken on my show and so forth, I've heard a lot of people say, yeah, this echoes my journey from religion to atheism. So I've got a lot of independent confirmation from people who say, yeah, this sounds like it. I have very few, if any, people come to me and say, no, this doesn't sound like me at all. So, by the way, while you were talking, I was pulling up my data and statistics. Only 30% of the cases I studied had relatives in the ministry.
Okay, when you say in the ministry, like full time?
Yeah, so here we have a grandfather that was a preacher, and here, in this case, Bart Campolo. His father, Tony Campolo, was a minister and an author and a sociologist, all working in that field. Music minister, a father that's a music minister, a quote unquote church leader, which I guess means some kind of elder, influential person within the church, traveling music minister. I'm just reading down a list here, but you get the idea. Missionaries, that both of their parents were missionaries. Are you familiar with Michael Behe? All right, so he's a biologist who came up with the idea, didn't come up with, but lent to the idea of intelligent design. Have you heard of intelligent design at all? Okay, so yeah, this was one of the movers and shakers, one of the influencers of the intelligent design model. His son became an atheist. So his dad wasn't, technically a minister in the strictest sense, but he wrote in the field of intelligent design, which is religious, at least linked to religion in nature. And then have you heard of Matt Slick from CARM? CARM, Christian Apologetics Research Ministry? Well, he's a fairly visible apologist. His daughter became a atheist. So this gives you an idea of what I'm talking about when I say they had relatives in the ministry.
Okay, so let's start with stage 1 of the 5-stage model. What is the first initial stage as to how people go about deconverting?
All right, so stage 1 is what I call setting conditions. Setting conditions, asking what was their background as a religious person. What did that look like for them? What kind of behaviors did they have as a religious person? What kind of beliefs did they have? What kind of religious environment did they exist within? So we're looking for common features that this person is eventually going to exit from. And this turns out to be one of the most important parts of my model, because the setting conditions is something that I've studied a little bit further than any of the other researchers that I've read, but we can get into that later. Stage number 2 is stressors. Now, stressors are any kind of experience or idea that causes the person's religious beliefs to become stressors or doubtful or problematic in their life. So, for example, just general, Bible questions like, why did God command genocide? Or, what's the deal with a 6-day creation when all the science points to evolution? Or it could be life things like, if God wants me to have the best life possible, why am I having a divorce right now? Or, why did my mother get sick and I prayed for her and she died anyway? Just general kinds of things like this. And it may not be something so obvious as that. It may be something like musicians who are traveling. In that sense, it's this constant travel that becomes a stressor. So when I say stressor, I mean ideas or life circumstances that contribute towards this discomfort the person feels with their religion. So that's the stressor stage. Stage number 3 is the trigger. Now, the trigger is when that person goes from just having these problems, these stresses on their religion, to starting to ask the questions. At some point prior to the trigger, their thoughts are, well, let's just push all these doubts aside. Let's not look at these. Let's not look real closely at these problems that I have. We'll put those to the side. We'll just kind of keep those out of the way. The trigger is the tipping point at which they start to actually critically examine the problems that they're having. I say that it gives them intellectual permission to start to examine their beliefs versus just kind of accepting them without question. And then the stage number 4 is the process. Now, the process is what most study focuses on, because this is the period of struggle, right? This is the period during which the person starts asking those difficult questions. They start struggling with their problems. They start having the doubts that sort of mature into unbelief. So, this is the most visible part of the deconversion process, because it's when the person feels that those doubts, they feel that process. They're going through the sort of mental and intellectual and emotional process of moving from religion to irreligion. All of the other things I've mentioned, the setting conditions, the stressors, the trigger, those kind of happen unconsciously. They're leading up to this real deconversion process. So that's stage 4. And stage 5 is the deconversion itself. Now, in stage 5, this person will eventually need to confess to themselves and then eventually to the world that they are no longer a Christian or religious. They are an unbeliever. So they consciously adopt this new identity, and then they sort of show that identity to the world. And studies kind of relate that to the process of a homosexual person coming out of the closet, finally showing the world that, hey, this is my identity now. In the case of deconversion, my identity is now an atheist. It's no longer a Christian. I think this is not a person who's just kind of sitting around quietly on their own, coming to the conclusion that, hey, I believe I'm an atheist now. This is a person who's surrounded by other Christians. This is a person whose family is Christian. Their friends are Christian. It's not an easy part of their life to take this step forward and say, hey, remember how I used to sing in the choir and, preach in front of the audience and all of these things? I no longer believe any of those things. It's a drastic shift in identity that both them and their community has to get used to. That's my 5-stage model.
Okay, and I'm looking at your 5-stage model. It looks similar. It looks like the 5 parts of a narrative. There's an introduction, right? The setting, we set the stage as to understanding the conditions of what the church is, society, the other characters that's around the protagonist, right? And then the stage 2 would be the rising action, where we identify the conflict and sort of it's leading to the trigger, which is the climax, right? And the climax there is the tipping point as to the main struggle, and really encountering the issue of whether or not one should deconvert. And then the 4, the falling action, everything is just falling into place, and until at the 5, right, they decide for themselves in the end, if they are deconverting or not. So does your 5-stage model include people who stopped at stage 4 and then just went back and just decided, hey, I'm not going to deconvert and proceed with stage 5?
That's a really interesting question. And you make an interesting observation in terms of the story arc, which I can return to if you'd like. But regarding your question, when I sit down to study deconversion, I have to look up narratives of deconverts. There are a lot less people out there who are putting their stories forward and getting up in the front of the world and saying, hey, I almost deconverted and then I didn't. And so as a result, I'm not seeing the terminated processes, the unsuccessful deconversion attempts, the successful rescues of one's belief. And I'm sure they're out there, and it's not as if I haven't encountered those. One of the most notable ones would be Sean McDowell, because he's a very visible Christian apologist, and he frequently shares his story of how he came to question his beliefs, and he started looking at the evidence, and eventually this made him a stronger Christian, but not before he struggled with it. So no, I have not developed a fully fleshed out model of a person who successfully returned from the brink and didn't deconvert. Now, there are models for people who fully deconverted, adopted the identity of an atheist. They went through stage 5 where they told the world that, hey, I'm an atheist now. And then over a period of time, they eventually became Christian again. So, I mean, their model of deconversion looks like what I just talked to you about, but then they come back to the faith, which is a completely different question. It's a different story and a different model.
So in terms of the story arc, of course, that is normal, right? Like we as humans, um, we find ourselves as the character in experiencing the conflict, and then finally deciding for ourselves that we are going to deconvert. Or and so can you tell me about the narratives that why this is why this is the case for many people that deconvert, that it's why is it so significant for them to talk about it and be open about it, like in a lot of societies, especially in Europe, it's often the case that people don't mind nowadays. It's pretty normalized if you sort of deconvert, right? Why do you think this study is still significant?
When a person shares a deconversion story, they're doing so for some reason out there. And so, again, when I say I'm going to study deconversion, where do I find the data for this deconversion? Well, the only place I can find data is from people who are sharing their stories. Now, this begs the question, is there a chunk of society out there who are deconverting and then not getting on a podcast or starting a YouTube channel or writing a book or, becoming very vocal and visible about their story? One has to assume there are many people like that. They're not blogging about their deconversion or getting on these atheist forums and sharing their story with everybody. And so what does that person look like? What's their process look like? I have no way of telling that because I don't have access to that information. So when I present the model, as I just did to you, I have to qualify it and say, this model really only applies to the type of person who then is vocal about their deconversion process. It can't speak to the quiet people out there who aren't sharing their stories. I know nothing about them because I don't have access to those stories. And so, that contributes to an extent to this idea of the story arc, because these are people who are out there sharing their stories, meaning that they form some kind of narrative to share. Now, in order to kind of address that point, I'd like to return to conversion research. Conversion research has been around since as long as psychology has been around. Freud, for instance, had some things to say about religion, as did B.F. Skinner, and the founder of the National Psychology Association and one of the movers and shakers in the psychology of religion was William James, who wrote a book titled A Variety of Religious Experiences, in which he laid out a model of conversion. And one of the things that conversion researchers have struggled with over the years is asking the question, how do we know when the conversion process is complete? At what point is this person fully religious and, a member of the religion at this time? And it's been generally agreed upon that the moment that this person is able to get out and share their testimony, and by testimony, I mean their story of how they became religious, at that point, their conversion process is complete, because they have formed in their head this full narrative of how I went from point A to point B, and they're able to now share that narrative over and over again. And what this means is this person has come to a point where they've been able to look back over their life experience and reinterpret that experience in light of their current beliefs. So back before they became a Christian, the kinds of experiences that they were having would look very different to them while they were having those experiences than they did in retrospect, now that they're looking back over it as a Christian. And one finds the same thing happening in deconversion narratives. This is a person who is looking back over their life through the lens of an atheist. So back in the day when they were praying to God and they were fully convinced that there was a God hearing them, that experience looks a great deal different now that they're an atheist looking back on the experience. At the moment that they were having this sort of worshipful experience where they felt the presence of God, it was a very different kind of experience for them, and that has to be reinterpreted once they deconvert through the lens of atheism. And so they develop what is essentially an atheist testimony. And that atheist testimony is a reinterpretation of my life story through the lens of atheism. And by the time I hear this story as a researcher, it's been told several times, it's been rehearsed in their mind, if nothing else, and it's a fully fleshed out story, as you've observed.
I see, and this is pretty interesting because it can sort of also dive into the no true Scotsman fallacy that a lot of atheists that I guess push towards a lot and a certain theology that a lot of Christians have, which is that when you left the faith, right, you were never really part of the faith. You were just sort of part of the religion and just going with the flow. But you have left the faith because you were never really truly saved nor born again, or the other theological concepts of salvation, being part of the Christian collective in terms spiritually. So have you also dived into this? And because these are atheist testimonies, and most of them are going to say like, oh, I was a truly Christian and I truly believed that I was saved and born again, but I realized that all that was just a farce. Have you any data about on this?
Well, I mean, the question that you're asking is not a scientific question, it's a spiritual question. As a psychologist, I don't have access to what's going on in the spiritual realm and what's going on in their heart and mind and so forth. I have access to observations of their behavior and their personal testimonies of what, and so if you really want to insult a deconvert, you tell them they were never Christian in the first place, which is something they hear, especially as they complete stage 5 and they deconvert and tell the world they're an atheist. They're going to hear this quite a bit from their family and friends and religious community that, well, you must never have been a Christian to begin with. And, it's a true struggle for the Christian to have to kind of deal with this fact that this person that I knew and fellowshipped with as a Christian suddenly says they don't believe in God anymore. What does that make of their Christianity? Theologically, I don't consider myself a theologian, at least not professionally. And so it's not a question that I can answer by way of psychology data. I can present to you the data. Now, what I can say is that when it comes to religion, that's another question that researchers have is, what do we mean when we say religion? What is religion? And so generally speaking, they've boiled religion down into 2 things: behaviors and beliefs. Behaviors being things like going to church every Sunday and raising your hands while you worship, and maybe praying, reading your Bible, all of these kinds of things that are considered religious behaviors. And then, of course, the beliefs are the things that you hold to be true, or that you at least tell people you believe are true about religion. So those would be things like the Trinity, a 3-in-1 God, or sort of a sanctification, the substitutionary atonement, different things like that. These are beliefs that you have that make you religious. And so some combination of beliefs and behaviors form religion. Now, I can tell you what the beliefs and behaviors of these people were, but when it comes to conversion research, a conversion researcher sees conversion as a behavior. It's a change in the person's behavior from acting one way to acting another. Now, does that behavior reflect some kind of spiritual reality? Maybe or maybe not, but all we can observe is the change that occurs in their behavior. So I would say that it's a category error to conflate conversion with salvation. Salvation is a theological category that says that, hey, I've got a ticket into heaven now. I've got a promissory note from God that when I die, I'm going to go to heaven. And so the question then becomes, did this person, once hold this note in their hand saying, hey, I'm getting to heaven, and then at some point they kind of threw the note away and now they're no longer going to heaven? Because salvation, you could argue that salvation doesn't occur until that person is actually saved. And by saved, we mean rescued from death or what have you. And so conversion, on the other hand, is a change in their behaviors and the things that they talk about, which is something visible. That's something we can see. We can't see the promissory note, the IOU, the ticket into heaven, or whatever salvation implies, which is a theological category. Well, I mean, conversion happens to every religion. So, presumably not every religion is true, but people convert to every religion, meaning they change their behaviors to that religious behavior. So if we conflate conversion with salvation, we would have to say that every religion is true because every religion has converts.
And in terms of how you define the deconversion, of course, I would want I wish I could have done this in the first part of the interview. But when you say deconversion, does it include, or is it part of the scope of the study when it comes to people who left, like, let's say, Hinduism, or or Buddhism, or Eastern Orthodoxy, or not just the Protestant type of churches?
So in deconversion research, I mean, the initial deconversion research would say something to the effect of every conversion is a deconversion, meaning that you discard one way of believing or thinking and adopt a different way of believing or thinking. And on that philosophy, you could say that when you become an atheist, you convert to atheism. So there's a deconversion involved, meaning you get rid of religion, and a conversion involved, meaning you move to atheism. I think that that's probably not a fair category when it comes to atheism, because it's very difficult to define atheism in terms of practices and beliefs, because there are no really shared practices and beliefs that have been set down in a religious book of some kind or systematized theologically, because theology is sort of a category that's rejected once one becomes an atheist. Now, I'd be happy to do a study on Hindus that became atheists, or Muslims that became atheists, or anything like that. But the ultimate termination point of deconversion is saying, hey, I'm an atheist. I do not believe. I am not religious. In fact, I have a stance on religion which stands against religion. If I would just say, hey, I'm not religious, you wouldn't necessarily think, hey, he's an atheist. All you would say is, well, he's not religious. He doesn't practice religion. He doesn't hold religious beliefs. Atheism is a theological category, meaning you take a certain stance on things like the existence of God, the morality of the Bible, the sort of practice of prayer. These are spiritual things that you would have definite things to say about, which in a sense is theology, because you're making statements about the truth or falsity of certain religious propositions.
So in terms of the data that you have collected, does it include Muslims and Hindus who become atheists?
It does not, because that would have been a very broad net to cast. And you don't want to overgeneralize when you're doing a study like this. You have to narrow your scope and make statements about those things which you can collect data. Because I can't assume that the deconversion process for a Hindu would look identical to the deconversion process for a Christian. And that I'm assuming Muslims would go through a different deconversion process, or at least I can't assume that it's the identical. Now, I mean, in the larger sense, eventually maybe I'll get to the point where I'm studying various other religions wherein believers become unbelievers, and I'll be able to say, hey, does my model work in those cases? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I don't have the, as a researcher, you really want to narrow your focus so that it's not too broad.
So your research for now is simply limited to Christian deconversions.
I have experienced a little pushback because I included Catholicism in there, and Catholicism isn't identical to Protestantism. So at least one other researcher that, actually the most prominent researcher in this field currently, when he did his study, he didn't include Catholics because he needed to narrow his scope down to just Protestants. And, I'm fairly convinced that my model would work for Mormons as well, or Jehovah's Witnesses, but I didn't include them in the study because the variety of beliefs involved and the social structure is too broad to include in Christianity. For instance, there were stories that I listened to of people who were ostensibly Christian, but when they left, they were part of some sort of Christian cult where there was some kind of dynamic leader and they were living together in a commune and they were importing practices from other spiritual backgrounds into their Christian beliefs, and things like that. And that began to stray so far away from sort of this Christianity as defined by a very specific set of beliefs and practices that I didn't want to include it because, you include.
We're moving in a new direction, moving forward, and moving beyond smoking. We are Altria, and our companies are leading the way in moving adult smokers away from cigarettes by taking action to transition millions toward potentially less harmful choices as we move from being known as a tobacco company to being recognized as a tobacco harm reduction company. Altria is moving beyond smoking. Find out how at altria.com.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.
Too broad of data in there, and your conclusions are less certain because you haven't stuck to a specificity of beliefs and practices and background.
Well, it seems to me then that you're sort of looking. I guess this is a close-ended research, right? Not an open-ended research where you would just collect data from a broad collection of people who have gone through a process of deconversion from whatever belief system that they were previously in. So in this sense that when I say close ended, like you were going to a certain direction that you already wanted to go to at the first part. That is why you sort of selected a group of Protestant denominations that had a similar theology and similar church structure and environments for people, right?
I've been doing this as an independent researcher, not an academic researcher, because I wasn't attached to an academic institute at the time I began this research. And in reading other research in the field, generally speaking, I actually cast too broad a net because I was including Americans and Europeans. I was including Catholics and Protestants and general things like that. If you read the research in this area, they will make a distinction between, say, German Protestants versus Chinese Protestants. And, they'll look at different cultural influences that confound the factors and change the kind of background beliefs that each person in the study has. And so there's quite a bit of thing, when you do study like this, you have to control for things like race and gender and economic status and all of these things. Ideally as a researcher, you want to have controls for all of these features to see how many of them might be confounding variables which would make a difference in this person's background. I have not done that statistically, and so my study is not as conclusive as it would be had it been more rigorously academic. And that's one of the reasons that I'm pursuing dissertation, because I would need to repeat the study using the higher standards of the academic institute.
So initially then your research of deconversion is mainly for American Protestant deconversions, right?
It's not strictly American. I would say American and European, but I would say most of the people that I included were American. Some Europeans, mostly American.
Yeah, I see. Can you tell me, I guess, what were the common features of the reasons for deconversion, or what would the stressors that the people experience, and then what that really brought them to the trigger?
So I can give you the frequency of objections that you heard from them, but I don't find those to be fundamental to this process. When you're talking about the stressors, I connect the stressors with the setting conditions, the background, stage one. And so if you will allow me, I'll tell you about the setting conditions, and then I'll link those to the stressors, if that's okay. All right. So in terms of setting conditions, I've identified 5. The first of these is isolationism. Now, when I say isolationism, what I mean is a religious environment which discourages the religious adherents, the believers, from interacting with influences outside of that religion. So they're discouraged from going and seeing movies, for instance, or reading secular books, or listening to pop music, or having sort of close friendships or relationships outside of the church. All of their interactions have to kind of stay within a religious environment because of a fear of outside influences. And this is, in America, at least, you see a rise in homeschooling because there's a fear in the religious community of the kinds of things that their children will be taught within public schools that might conflict with their religious beliefs. And so this is isolationism. It's people who are kind of isolated from the outside world and restricted to their religious communities. So this is a common feature you find to one degree or another in the background of most of these deconverts. I should mention at this point that I don't think I have seen a case of deconversion yet wherein the person didn't become religious as a child or begin identifying as Christian as a child. Typically, they grew up within a Christian family and church, and so they identified as Christian by default, if you will. They didn't really convert to Christianity. They were Christian by default. Now, there are a few exceptions where the person converted as a child, at latest, maybe an early teenager, 13 or 14 years old. But at no point have I seen a case where a person who was an adult converted to Christianity and then later deconverted. It's always somebody who's grown up within a church environment. All right, so that's isolationism. The second is performance control. Now, performance control, by that I mean they belong to a religious environment that sort of controls each individual within that environment by way of things like approval and disapproval of various behaviors. There are certain things which are understood by that church that you're allowed to do, and certain things that you're definitely not allowed to do. And then there are other things that you get praised for. If you are especially involved in one thing or another, you get more accolades and praise from that religious environment from there. So the environment controls the behavior of that individual through approval and disapproval. So that's performance control. The third is textualism. Now, textualism is a legal term, and in legal circles, textualism means that you read the law by the letter of the law. You don't try to read between the lines. You take it as stated. In this case, I'm using the word to talk about the way that the person approaches the scriptures. So in textualism, they have sort of a very wooden, literal interpretation of scriptures wherein they're not allowed to have any kind of flaw or problem with them, and they have to kind of fit their particular religious narrative. So I say that people in the extreme cases of textualism generally believe that the scripture was written by God through people, and that it contains the actual words of God from beginning to end, and that it was written for everyone everywhere through all time, such that a, say, young girl in the Philippines could pick up the Bible and read it in her language, and an old man in America could pick up the Bible and read it in his language, and the original Jewish audience was reading the Bible in their language, and all of them were getting the exact same message and understanding from the scripture because it was written to them by God for all people everywhere, all through all time. So that's textualism. The fourth is spiritualism. Spiritualism refers to a kind of religion that focuses on the supernatural element above and beyond any kind of natural element. So in spiritualism, these are churches or communities that see the world as fundamentally supernatural and superficially natural or material. So these are the kinds of communities that believe that there are demons or angels around every corner kind of pulling the strings, and that everything that happens to me is by direct intervention from some kind of spiritual force, and that God expects certain behaviors from me and will bless me for certain things, curse me for other things. And this kind of church community also tends to put a lot of emphasis on prophecy and sort of the end times doctrines and so forth. So that's spiritualism. And the final one was the one that took me the longest to get my head around, because I saw it as a constant trend throughout these testimonies, but I didn't quite understand it. And this is what I call compulsive certainty. So compulsive certainty refers to this idea that your environment expects you to have a high level of confidence or even certainty on the things that you believe, meaning that you don't just suspect that you're going to go to heaven. You have to be sure that you're going to go to heaven. Sort of this evangelical question of, if you died tonight, are you certain that you would be led into heaven, kind of thing. And you have to kind of be certain of the truth of Scripture with no kind of wiggle room at all. If you're not absolutely certain, then this reflects some kind of sin or spiritual fault on your part. So you have to have a high level of confidence or certainty in order to be considered a faithful Christian. And any kind of question or doubt or uncertainty is seen as practically a sin on your part. So those are the 5 setting conditions, the 5 background conditions seen in these deconversion stories. Not every story has all 5, but every story has 1 or 2 at least.
Well, I can see where you're going with this, but in terms of, I've done a lot of interviews of atheists who left Christianity, right? And a lot of them are actually were found these, irrelevant, I guess, but maybe it would have been play with them, I don't know, in the background. But the main reasons for why they deconverted was because of some, in relation to their knowledge of the truth, and if they could and their discovery for themselves, if the religion that they were in actually stated the truth, right, like philosophically or theologically, at the minimum. So where would this fall on the common features of or reasons for deconversion in your?
Okay, so in behavioral psychology, we have something called an establishing operation, and that is some kind of circumstance that increases the probability of a certain behavior. And these are what I would call establishing operations. Now, to give you an example of what I mean by that, if you were to, say, eat a lot of salty food, this would become an establishing operation for drinking liquids. It would increase the probability that person would then go and get a drink of some sort, because this condition or environmental circumstance has established the drinking behavior by way of these circumstances. Another example would be going on a fast and then seeing a hamburger. The hamburger becomes a much more potent reinforcer if you haven't eaten for a very long time. So the period of time that you didn't eat becomes an establishing operation for the hamburger as a potent reinforcer. Now, circling around to what that means in my study, if I go through the 5 stages or the 5 features, the 5 operations, modes is what I call them, the 5 modes of these deconversion churches, if you will, each of them contributes to the stressors. So isolationism, as an example, if you are not exposed to the outside world except by way of what your religious people are telling you about the outside world, then exposure to that outside world becomes a much more potent reinforcer for the deconversion experience. So you exit the religious environment because you have to go to school or you have to get a job in the real world or something like that. And suddenly you're encountering all of these ideas that you had not encountered while you were isolated in this sort of religious bubble. Or you encounter ideas that you thought you knew about, but you didn't really because you'd only ever heard of them from a religious perspective. A good example of this would be evolution. So often people within these sort of isolationist religious environments are told that evolution is kind of an evil and that it is, unscientific and so on and so forth. And they'll be presented with this picture of evolution, this model of evolution that does sound fairly preposterous. And then it will be debunked by various ways that the Christian environment uses to debunk it. And then the same person will go to college and they'll take a biology course and they'll start to hear about evolution from an evolutionary scientific standpoint. And suddenly it seems a lot more realistic and a lot more reasonable than it did while they were in the Christian environment. And suddenly they begin to question, hey, this Christian environment, didn't present this to me in a robust manner, which might be interpreted as lying, that my Christian environment lied to me about evolution. I don't think it was lying. I think it was just bad information or misunderstanding or sincere mistakes. But nonetheless, this exposure to this new idea that you didn't encounter within the isolated religious environment becomes much more potent as an objection to your religious beliefs, as opposed to a person who grew up in, say, a public school and was taught evolution from first grade to graduation. And, they're very familiar with the idea, and it's not as big a problem to them because it's kind of a familiar notion. And hey, maybe even it can be reconciled with their religious belief. It's not a big deal. But to a person who's never encountered it until they're an adult, it does become a big deal. And to a general extent, you could expand that to the notion of just encountering different worldviews in general, like different religious worldviews. You meet a person of a different religion that's as sincere about their religion as you are about yours, and you've never encountered a person like that before. You start to hear atheist arguments that you've never heard about before because you've been isolated within this Christian environment. And all of these things become far more potent because you haven't been exposed to them than they would be otherwise. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely. I really see where you're going here, and I really find this very profound in terms, and I myself can really relate in some moments there. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing about isolationism is that when all of your friends and family are Christians, then you don't, there's a sort of tribalism involved. There's an us versus them kind of idea, that there's Christians and then there's everybody else who are not Christians. And you're given the general impression that Christians are the authentic people and everybody else out there is inauthentic. And then you exit into the world and you start to make friends in the secular community. And maybe some of the people that you encounter are very much different than what your religion would allow them to be. So for instance, you meet an atheist and the atheist is an okay guy. He's really nice. He's not immoral. He is, more sincere than some of the Christians that you know. Or maybe you meet a homosexual person for the very first time, and you've been told a certain thing about homosexuals within your Christian environment, and this person doesn't meet that, doesn't conform to that idea. And so you start to interact with people that your religious environment has told you are not authentic, and you start to realize, hey, these people are authentic. Something's wrong with the information that I've been given. And so as you start to form relationships outside of that Christian bubble, the Christian bubble seems less up. So that's isolationism. Moving on to performance control. Performance control is in itself just aversive. You're in this environment where you're told you can't do certain things, and you're kind of given disapproval when you do those things. And so you start to want to do things outside of that environment. A very common example of this would be sexual in nature. Religious environments are very much against the idea of having sex in, most ways outside of marriage. And so if you happen to be a teenager who really, really, really wants to have sex, and so you start to do that with your boyfriend or girlfriend, and suddenly there's this sense of guilt that comes with that, right? Because you're acting in a way that goes against the morals of your Christian environment, and if anybody found out about that, they would disapprove, and it would be devastating. And so the Christian environment becomes much less desirable as your life goes on, and you start to do things and act in a way that you want that freedom to act outside of the boundaries of the approval and disapproval of this Christian environment, and not that the environment demands that you perform. That makes sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so that's performance control. Textualism. The number one argument or objection that I have heard in these deconversion experiences has to do with the Bible. For some reason, the Bible is the number one objection that people. Now, the Bible is a broad category that could include things like religions versus science, because you have to take what the Bible says above what science says. It could have to do with creationism versus evolutionism, which is a flavor of the same thing. But it could also have to do with things like morally objectionable material within the Bible. So God commands that you go and kill a bunch of children or something like that, or God drowns the entire world in the flood, or various things like that, which seem pretty despicable as you look at them. And then there could be things that just seem kind of ridiculous within the text, like miracle accounts, for instance. Joshua makes the sun stand still in the sky. And so it starts to sound more and more ridiculous the older you get and the more you think about it. And other things could be historical errors or contradictions in the Bible. Basically, all of these features that one finds in the Bible become very potent objections if one has been told that the Bible is without flaw, without error, and perfectly written by God. The more emphasis is put on the perfection and absoluteness of the scriptures, the more potent these scriptural objections become as stressors toward deconversion. Make sense?
Yeah, I see. Okay, but in terms of textualism, how do you know which one is which church, or which sample, or which case that actually has textualism and which one does not, right? Like you have to have sort of a standard of, or line that where you could determine that it is the case that it is textualism at play here.
Well, generally, when I speak of textualism in these church backgrounds, what I'm looking at is, again, I have to go by the stories as they are told by the deconverts. And so when the story includes objections to scripture based on things they were taught at church, then I can say that church taught them in some way that had textualist features to it, because it led to objections about the Bible which were potent towards their deconversion. If a person were to say that Yeah, I mean, the Bible has some things that are, a little questionable in it, but that doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. Then that person doesn't emerge from a textualist background. If the person says, you know,
Anything that involves the Bible, like which as the reason for them deconverting and don't know what the Bible means to, or how they interpret the Bible, it's textualism.
yeah, it has to do with the interpretation of that. Because if the person's objection is something like, Jonah was swallowed by the whale, there's no way that could happen in real life, therefore God doesn't exist, something like that. That leap from there's a problem with the Bible, therefore God doesn't exist, leads me to believe that they placed a lot of value on the perfection of Scripture as the sort of evidence of the proof of religion. If they are able to look at Scripture and say, yes, there's a problem here, but not make that leap to therefore God does not exist, then the Scripture has not been enforced upon them as the sort of sole foundation of belief. But the more objectionable the Bible becomes, clearly the more emphasis has been placed on the perfection of that Bible.
Cool. And for the spiritualism, though, I find this very interesting because when so would you say that there's sort of a metric where this church is very less spiritualistic and this one is a lot more, or I guess puts more emphasis to it? Doesn't this seem very subjective as well? Because most, I guess, I would say like all, churches involve at least some sort of spiritualism, you know, where God is like the encompassing entity that is the cause of everything. How would you?
So again, when I talked about spiritualism, I said that it's a church environment that says that the universe is fundamentally supernatural and superficially natural. And that would be contrasted with a church that kind of sort of teaches, hey, this is everyday life. They'll teach the scriptures as more like a historical account, something like that. So deconverts come most frequently from a Pentecostal or a Catholic background. Those are the two types of churches where one sees the most deconversion. And so both of them would qualify as spiritualist churches because Pentecostalism sort of enforces this kind of, your life will go very well if you do all of these spiritual things. And it almost has a karmic aspect to it. If you're suffering, it's because you're not being spiritual enough. If you're prospering, it's because God is blessing you for your spirituality. And in these Pentecostal type churches, they seek out this kind of ecstatic religious experience where you kind of fall on the floor and convulse because you felt the Spirit come upon you. You speak in tongues. You do these kinds of things which really relate to these ecstatic spiritual experiences versus, say, learning about the history of, the construction of the Mosaic texts or something like that. So it's this idea that, an emphasis is placed upon spirituality as part of your everyday life, and you see demons and angels behind everything. Now, spiritualism, when it becomes a stressor, it does so for one of two reasons. First of all is the sort of science versus religion type thing. For a person who comes from a spiritualist background, from a church that stresses supernaturalism over naturalism, and they say enter university or begin to become interested in science, suddenly spirituality starts to look a lot more ridiculous, or spiritualism starts to look a lot more ridiculous when you start to view the world as fundamentally natural and perhaps superficially supernatural, if at all. And you start to see that, this is where you get the atheist objection that, science has disproved God based on this assumption that we need God as an explanation for ordinary things. God is the reason the sun rises. When you discover that God is not the reason the sun rises, then we don't need God anymore. If you're going to believe that ordinary things are the result of the supernatural, then when you find more out about the natural world, you don't need that supernatural nearly as much as you used to. So that's one thing. And the other is sort of maturity. As you go through life, the supernatural, the spiritualism starts to look more ridiculous as you go on, because you don't need a devil and an angel around every corner to cause these ordinary things. And things like miracle accounts and stuff. There's a third thing, by the way, and that is the miracle account. That's that kind of thing where the church says, hey, if we get together and we pray and we put our hands on this person, her cancer will be cured. And then that doesn't happen. You seek out these spiritual experiences and you do not get the spiritual experience. Then spiritualism has fallen apart. So you're in church and you're kind of faking speaking in tongues because everybody else is doing it. And at some point it occurs to you that, hey, if I'm faking speaking in tongues, then maybe the other people are too, kind of thing. So it's seeking out these spiritualist experiences and not getting them. It's seeing, prayers not being answered. It's studying science and realizing that you don't need a supernatural explanation for ordinary things, and so on and so forth, where this becomes a stressor. That makes sense?
And the last one was with the compulsive certainty. Doesn't that are there, I guess, churches that don't require compulsive certainty?
Well, I would say that there has to be some level of certainty and uncertainty. Yeah, I mean, okay, so with the rise of apologetics, for instance, you have churches that say, hey, you can go ahead and have doubts and questions. Let's explore those. They give you permission to ask the questions and have the doubts. They sort of normalize doubting. They say that this is an experience we all go through. We all have doubts. We all have questions. It's difficult to find answers sometimes. And when that sort of thing is normalized and not condemned or stigmatized, that's the word I'm looking for. When it's normalized and not stigmatized, then it becomes less of a stressor. But if you're taught that your doubts, the very fact that you're having doubts, questions, stressors, lacks of conviction are evidence that you are, in some way spiritually deficient, then the very act of doubting becomes evidence of the falseness of your religion. The more doubts, the more questions you have, those doubts and questions themselves are evidence against the religion, because that certainty no longer exists.
So compulsive certainty actually refers to the stigmatization of a certain healthy skepticism.
In addition to other things, when I say compulsive, I'm not talking about I'm not talking about impulsive. I'm talking about compulsory. You are compelled to be certain about things or to have a high level of confidence. Are you familiar with street epistemology at all? Okay, so if you ever watch street epistemology in action, one of their primary techniques, something you'll see them do quite often, is to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how certain are you that God exists, or that the Bible was written by, eyewitnesses or something like that? They'll give you that scale of 1 to 10, and then they'll ask you your level of certainty. What they've identified is this compulsive certainty feature of religion, because a person who's brought up in that background, when they're asked to rate their level of certainty on something, if they dig internally and realize that they don't have 100% certainty, that they can't be a 10 on that scale, then the fact that they're an 8 and not a 10 is therefore evidence against that. So street epistemology has really focused or kind of honed in on a very effective feature of the deconversion process.
To be honest, I find this really surprising, because these are really good stuff, to be honest, and I myself as a Christian actually see this as, if you stating the case that these the 5 things, common features are problems, there are a lot of good applications, but of course you as a researcher, you have no actual biases into this. You just observe the data and state the results, right? But you've probably, of course, put this information around and have had a lot of feedback. Can you talk about those feedbacks?
Sure. So not too terribly long ago, I was talking to another researcher who had done modeling for, let me see if I can. So it's a type of thinking, and it's complexity thinking. That's it. He'd done complexity thinking modeling and compared atheist complexity to religious complexity. And, his modeling, the purpose of his study was to determine if this trope that religious people were black and white, inflexible thinkers without a lot of complexity of thought versus atheists being very complex thinkers that have, more grays and less nuance or more nuance in their thinking. So he had modeled this using some analytical programs and had come to the conclusion that no, there isn't that much difference. There are different elements that religious people can be a little less flexible on, but there are other elements that atheist or irreligious people can be less flexible on. And his model rated religious people slightly ahead of atheists, but not significantly ahead of atheists in terms of complexity of thought. And so when he was reading my model, as I had put it out, he told me that he thinks that just including a little bit more complexity of thought would be a buffer against this kind of thinking that causes the deconversion. And that's become my perspective as well, is that you could tend to eliminate a good deal of the stressors if you allowed for a less rigid method of belief and thought. If you allowed for disagreement, for instance, in the church, if you allowed for the idea that the answer, I don't know, is an acceptable answer. You don't have to have the answers to all the questions, this sort of compulsive certainty. And, we've spoken again of these churches that have kind of adopted the apologetic approach that, hey, let's ask the questions, let's explore those questions, versus, no questions allowed. Questioning is a sign of doubting, and doubting is a sign of not having faith, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but of course, in terms of like spiritualism or textualism, that involves a huge change. If they were to sort of eliminate those factors, change in doctrines, right, and theology.
I think that in terms of textualism, a lot of the difficulties there would be reduced if one allowed for, if you got rid of this idea that the Bible was written directly by God, for instance, if you allowed for the fact that, in fact, the Bible was written by human beings, and that, yes, these things were guided, were inspired, let's say, but they contain the cultural and environmental features of the person writing them, and the biases, if you will, cultural biases, let's say, of the person writing it. Like a Jew writing a scripture would not think like an American writing a biography. And so, once you start to allow for these cultural features and start to explore the differences between the thinking of those writers and you as a 21st century, modern human being who is used to reading textbooks and biographies and things, which didn't exist back then. And so the audience to which they wrote and the perspective from which they wrote and the sort of cultural ideas which are not directly available to us would tend to clear up a lot of these problems, but would require you to allow for the fact that the Bible was not written for every human being to understand completely without any kind of background knowledge.
All right. Well, Joel, it's been awesome having you on the interview. And one last question will be, what looking forward, where are you willing to take this? Are you planning to write a book about it as well? Because you did mention to me earlier that you are also going to use this as for your research on your doctoral thesis.
Yes. So when you do a dissertation, you have to write it almost like a book. So this would end up coming out looking something like a book, but it would be very academic in nature. If I were to adopt it to a popular level book, the idea that I've had for quite a while now is to write a series of stories of conversions of atheists and then of the deconversions of Christians, and to kind of sit those back to back and then use my research to explain kind of the differences and allow people to see it.
I see. All right. Yeah.
Deconverted, that's a real concrete human story. It has that human interest element to it. But then that would also make the research, the principles that I'm kind of conveying to you, a lot more practical because you can see them in practice in these stories.
All right. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to it, Joel, because I really believe that once a lot of churches identify this, but this is coming from my personal, of course, bias on of being a Christian, that then identify these and actually make good changes. It would lessen the rate of people leaving, right? And the churches that they are in. And thank you so much, man. Hope that the interview I was a productive host today, and I really loved having you on. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I'm glad that was the case. I'm glad you had a positive experience. I did as well.
All right. Well, then thank you so much, and have a great day. So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
We're moving in a new direction, moving forward and moving beyond smoking. We are Altria, and our companies are leading the way in moving adult smokers away from cigarettes by taking action to transition millions toward potentially less harmful choices as we move from being known as a tobacco company to being recognized as a tobacco harm reduction company. Altria is moving beyond smoking. Find out how at altria.com.
It takes a lot of ingredients to fix or build a car, like cooking, but without the frozen dinner easy way out. eBay Motors has 122 million parts. It's always the right fitment, so you can follow any recipe to a T. Whether it's a vintage Italian coupe that's classic like grandma's meatballs, or a German luxury car that's as complicated as Oma's rouladen, to cook up something great in the garage, use the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.